Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all very much indeed for making it here to the first of today's sessions in the auditorium, which is on the theme of who do we trust to protect our children. We have two speakers who are going to set out slightly different visions for how we approach this issue. But there are so many different factors that we need to take into account. I think most in the room will have seen the well-publicised concerns that the Local Government Association has raised about the capacity of Ofsted to deliver judgments that we can rely on and that the public can rely on about the quality of our children's services. And as an elected member, I watched with a degree of horror the situation in Rotherham as it unfolded, with elected members being told by Ofsted at one stage things are going in the right direction, but once the media got their hooks in, to be told actually it was all inadequate throughout, and you should have known that. Well, of course, the whole point of Ofsted is it is supposed to be the objective, independent and credible regulator. But the last 5 years in children's services seem to have been marked by a search for alternative solutions, an introduction of market elements into children's services, something which is not unfamiliar to councils. I'm conscious that in the room today we have some private providers, we have representatives of charities, big organisations like Barnardo's that have been service providers to local government for a long time. So many of these things which sound controversial when debated on the national stage are very familiar to those of us who've been working in the sector for some time. But as government has begun to look at those children's services departments identified in the media and through Ofsted and elsewhere as failing or struggling, it's been pretty clear that there have not been many private sector providers stepping up to the plate. The likes of G4S, Serco have not been queuing up to say, let us take over your children's safeguarding function and run that for you. And the reasons for that, I guess we can all understand, but it does demonstrate that it falls once again to the sector to put together really effective solutions to address these kinds of challenges. So our two speakers are going to set out from their experience their view of these two areas of activity. And I'd like to invite to speak first Joe Miller. Joe will be very familiar to many in the room as a former senior officer both at the Local Government Association and as a big figure on the national scene when it comes to children's services, but most recently coming to prominence in her leadership role at Doncaster. Joe.
Thanks, David. I'm going to start out just perhaps by looking at some of the questions around ownership and inspection, although I'm afraid some of my views about inspection might be slightly ranty, and I know Amanda is going to give you some more compelling facts on that. And then I want to talk about what I think the real answer is to driving improvement. And then I'll talk to you about Doncaster Children's Trust and how we've come to that. So bear with me, I think it feels right to me to put it in that context. So in the context of who do we trust to protect our children, is a change in ownership the answer to improvement, and can inspection drive improvement in children's social care? And my answer to both of those questions is no. It's the leaders and managers and staff working with partners and communities who drive improvement in social care. Inspections shine a light on imperfect improvement at best, but it's the people involved in delivery, and perhaps some of the new people who should be involved in delivery, who innovate, improve and develop new services in response to our ever more challenging local context. In the context of change of ownership, is it the answer to improvement? No, it isn't, not per se. It is a triumph if you focus on that, it seems to me, of structure over standards, and the equivalent of the academisation of social care. I'm not against academies, but you know, there are good academies and there are bad academies. It's always about leadership and practice that makes a difference. So that's my answer. That's the context in which I start. Briefly on inspections, I won't rant too much. But they, you know, what are they? Well, inspectors see what they see when they see it, and they're backward looking from the very day they are published. I'm actually delighted, though, to say that in relation to Doncaster's education, our inspection report's published today of an inspection on the 30th of March. Actually, the start of March. I'm pleased to say it says we're moving in the right direction. So for all that I say that they're backward looking, we have to recognise that. I think the star ratings in the 90s have really played into an oversimplification of findings in reports, and they play to those media headlines that David referred to. You know, we've got this dubious terminology of requires improvement and inadequate, and it sometimes can feel that, you know, by embarrassing councils, we'll sometimes try and work harder. The inspection regime is very silent about the context in which we're working. And we all know about how we've had to reduce our money over the last few years. We've seen the Children's Commissioners today talk about the challenges to families. It sometimes feels that inspection can be seen as part of a cynical exercise in denigrating local authorities. One of the worst things for me is the kind of whole notion of how the inspection system purports to categorise councils in 4 boxes, in my terminology, from rubbish to brilliant. The rubbish councils are shamed, subjected to monitoring, and the brilliant councils are given new freedoms and let off from further inspections. For the rubbish councils, this is a real problem, and mine was one of them. They're subject to the double calamity of resignation and sackings of senior members and officers, vilification in the media, and the demoralisation and exit of hard-to-recruit social workers. So how does this drive improvement? It feels to me sometimes that you start your improvement journey with one arm tied behind your back, with turbulent leadership, an over-reliance on agency staff, at one point in Doncaster 45%, and the requirement to feed sort of an obsessive need to prove that things change, with, in truth, limited capacity to make that change, particularly when, if I take Doncaster, it had been I arrived in 2012, but it had been in DFE intervention since 2009, after a safeguarding inadequate across the board in 2008. Because it was in that category, it wasn't supported by the sector, but left to the DFE, and that was a real problem in terms of affecting capacity for that improvement. What should then drive improvement? And I'd suggest to you that all children's services, there used to be a time when people would look at Doncaster and say they're in the bad category. Well, you know, all of our children's services, be they outstanding or inadequate, face a triple jeopardy, it seems to me, of austerity, rising demand and poor outcomes. I think the existing model's broken, and I'd suggest we do need a new radical approach as to how we deliver children's services. There are 5 key elements. I think we do need to introduce competition, innovation and incentives in social care. Why has this been a municipal monopoly for so long, with the market only reluctantly embraced as a provider of last resort? I contrast this to other local authority services, housing, environment, adult social care. I contrast it to how we work with stronger families, where commissioning is ever more sophisticated, markets are developed and we provide innovative solutions, very often through the third sector. I do think we need to develop new service models, and our Children's Trust launched on the 30th of September. I'll tell you more about that in a moment, but in essence, it's an independent organisation delivering all social care services across the area on behalf of Doncaster Council. We believe that in doing this, it's bringing energy to children's services, but what I will talk about is I think there are much wider opportunities to take that model much further with different models of social ownership and by forming alliances with other agencies and the third sector. And for authorities outside the spectrum of DFE intervention, I would suggest to you that the scope is much greater and you have much more freedom to act. One of the biggest things is I think we need to challenge the cultural predominance within children's social care. Out of all the services that local authorities are responsible for, and I've said this before, it feels to me that children's services is the most driven by a professional elitism, which, whilst determining the values and beliefs of what works, has resisted the modernisation of services. The ADCS last year responded to the consultational document on the delegation of social care functions with lots of strategic shroud waving about the risks to children from profiteers, with no mention of the massive use of the private sector, for example, in the provision of agency social workers, independent fostering placements and residential homes. And that nonsense we saw there around only, a professional social worker can make decisions about children and it cannot have any form of private profit. Well, that's what that agency social worker's doing, who's been in the authority for 5 minutes and making a decision on her family. And are you telling me that they're more able to make that decision than a local head teacher who's worked with the family for 3 years and knows what they're doing? I think it's time to challenge some some of that system. And I'm sure both members and officers will recognise some of that dance that takes place at budget time around, in particular, children at risk. One of the other things we must put in place, actually for all that I'm critical of inspections, is a self-improving system. Why on earth are we as local authorities waiting for Ofsted to arrive to tell us the state of our services and whether they need to improve? And why are we allowing our residents to only see what happens to our services through that Ofsted lens? Lots of time spent measuring key performance indicators across the country, far less, it seems to me, measuring quality, and even less time on how to improve that quality. We need to reverse this. We need to regularly diagnose and assess where we're at and put an intense effort into improving frontline services. And I think if we do this and collaborate more as providers of children's services, when Ofsted come in, that narrative is there. Our staff understand it, our people understand it, and our children and families understand it. I do think we need an inspection system that's fair and proportionate, one that offers a narrative, a sense of journey travelled and direction, rather than crude categorisation. And with over 1/3 of councils now inspected so far under the Ofsted single inspection framework, and 75% of them judged as inadequate or requiring improvement, I put it to you that that's a pretty unsustainable solution, which I would say to DFE and to government, please don't let that trundle on. Let's seize it and do something with it. So let's go back to those models then, and a bit about Doncaster. As I say, I became the Chief Executive in January 2012. Part of my brief as Chief Executive was, we're nearly out of improvement, nearly out of intervention, not least because there had been an Ofsted the previous May in 2011 which judged safeguarding and looked after children across the board as being adequate, having been inadequate since 2008. I have to say it didn't feel like it to me when I looked over the summer that that's where it's at, because if the figures were to be believed, Doncaster had the most complex children and families by a factor of 4 compared to any other place in the country, and that is not the place that I work in and I'm a public servant in, and the members quite clearly had that in their mind. So because I became Chief Exec in 2012, in the November, we had an Ofsted which said we were inadequate across the board compared to that previous judgment the year earlier, predominantly around unallocated cases, which is completely inexcusable. And as a Chief Executive, I do not like to be surprised by anything. I always say to my staff, you can tell me the biggest problem is going to arrive on my desk. I don't mind, we can sort it out. Do not tell me it does not exist. I will not be happy. Of course, the council itself had been in corporate governance inspection since 2010, wearing the badge back then of the worst council in Britain. It had commissioners. It had commissioners for everything other than children's services, which was a separate DFE intervention, which was a source of great frustration. When that Ofsted report came in November, I'd actually been working with the LGA over the summer, and there were some things I really wanted to do, which I'd spoken to the department about. But because we were in intervention, I couldn't rely on our commissioners to act. So I have to say it was a very long, lonely time from that November, not one I'd wish on any chief executive, to know that you had a system that was fragile and unsafe, which then took us to March following at Ofsted, where the Legrand Allen Wood review was set up. It reported in May. I referred to the report as being disappointing but not surprising, which is some of the more polite language I used to mean I could pretty much guess what was in it. At the same time, Mayor Ros Jones was elected as a new mayor, and was very clear that this was absolutely top of the agenda in terms of improving services for children and families, so much so that we appointed a new DCS in her first week of office. In July, following the Legrand review, there was a direction that a commissioner would be established for children's social care functions. That was Alan Wood, who was one of the co-author of the Legrand Wood report, and they were ordered to create a company for children's social care, which would report direct to Whitehall and Westminster. We worked hard with the sector over the summer, and I think it was a really important win for the whole sector, not just for Doncaster. that if we were going to set up a children's trust for social care, that must be within a local accountability system, part of a safeguarding function locally, part of the wider partnership, and where the council acted as the commissioner of those functions, albeit that the trust itself would have independent operation, and accepting that whilst services to children and families were not good enough, the department would want some oversight of those. So in November of 2013, we had a memorandum of agreement which set out what we were to do. I should say that I was really pleased that Michael Gove accepted that situation and allowed that commissioning local accountability function to get put into place. So we set up the trust in 9 months. And I have to tell you that's an inhuman timescale and not one that I would wish on anybody. It wasn't my preference, but it was what we were ordered to do. And I think it's testament to the hard work of a lot of people, but also perhaps the increased ability of the local authority as its services had improved, that it had the capacity to put in place a brand new company limited by guarantee, disaggregate all of its services, disaggregate its budgets, cheaply transfer 480 staff in that time, and most importantly, our number one priority was to have a company operating that would be a safe company operating those services on the 1st of October last year. And that's when the trust came into being. It's a company limited by guarantee, it's autonomous, its chair is nominated by the Secretary of State, it's Colin Hilton. Again, even though the direction actually allowing for the company to be set up, the trust to be set up, came in September the year before, he wasn't appointed till February. So, government doesn't always run as fast as we needed it to run. So as I said, 480 staff transferred. The trust is there to provide all of children's social care across Doncaster. The Secretary of State agreed to pay the set-up costs, which were broadly 1.6 million. That doesn't include the authority's own costs. And then he also agreed to pay the extra costs of a separate organisation, which broadly equate to about 3.5 million over 18 months, including, because of the very hard nature of the structural split and not the one the authority recommended, and to my intense annoyance, £1.4 million of irrecoverable VAT, which I know just recirculates money around government, but it doesn't feel like a good use of public money. We see the Trust as a really strong partner in Team Doncaster. We want it to influence the services that it doesn't deliver, so it's not just a provider of services. Like all of the partners in our area, we believe that people who have our part of our Team Doncaster ethos will see things that they need to influence in other bits of the public service arena by the nature of the job they do. So what have we set it to do? High quality services and outcomes for children and families, our number one. A high quality workforce, and we're having some success with that. Agency workforce is now less than 10%. We want a strong player in Team Doncaster that sees itself as rooted in that community and delivering our kind of corporate objectives around making sure the place and its people thrive. We wanted quality support to the frontline services from the business function, and that governance and risk management enable those aims to be delivered. We said that all inadequacies had to be tackled by March 2016, and we had to create a solid foundation by then for a good or better service. That feels like it's on track. If you said to me, has the Trust been the right thing to do, I would have to say to you here and now the jury's out, because some of those metrics take us into that time. During the time the Trust was set up, the Council had improved its performance quite significantly. Whilst it had been improving since 2010, it is without question that with the election of Ros Jones as Mayor in May 2 years ago, there has been a sharp rise in the way in which we performed, so much so that the authority came out of intervention early, and for example in troubled families, we are one of the best performers in the country. So would that improvement have happened without the Trust? Quite possibly. Who knows? We're not there to look backwards. And what I will say is that some of the things that we should have improved, we undoubtedly didn't have the time to improve because we were so focused on bringing that Trust into being in that pretty inhuman timescale. So we're not averse to new models. The Secretary of State has said we must have it for at least 5 years, up to 10. People have said to me, will you have it? And what I've said is, who knows? What matters is providing good services to children and families. The Trust operates a £44 million budget. It's won £3 million of innovation bid from DFE. To anybody thinking about setting up a trust, I would suggest that there are better models than a company limited by guarantee owned by the directors of the company, who in our case comprise police and health, as well as some non-execs. And I'd urge anybody to look at the community interest company type model, which I think gives people far greater flexibility. We set up an Almo in Doncaster, largely for decency works, and lots of you will have done that back then. Many people have brought their Almos back in-house, decency having come to an end. We've actually given our Almo more functions in housing because it's delivering for residents and helping to make our place thrive. So who knows what the outcome for the Trust will be. What we're clear about, as both the Trust and the local authority, is we have an absolutely unique focus on making sure that things are the best for our children and families. Finally, people who know me will know that I like to touch and see things on the ground and not just look at the performance data. So knowing I was speaking to you today and some of the work I was doing last week, I went to speak to a couple of heads and some staff at the Trust, because we've got the staff survey, but I wanted to ask some people who, you know the way you have organisations where there's people who really tell you what it's like? So I went to find those people last week and asked them how it felt for them. They could see some improvements in social work practice, but still a real need to be more innovative around some of that. And for both the Trust and ourselves, we know we must get early help right and ground the accountability in the Safeguarding Board. For the members of staff, they felt very strongly that they were grounded in the partnership. They did say that there was more of an... because there are less layers, that there was if you had a good idea, it was easier to get it through. And I think the thing that struck me most was where they had a really sensible idea around grading a post. It didn't take 7 months, it took 7 days, which I think is a challenge to some of us with those organisations. So I'll leave it there. I think a mixed bag, and I'll happily answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jo. Some really good challenges there, and I can see a debate certainly building up on the question of, do we embrace the market and where does profit sit with children's services? Now, our next speaker brings a different perspective, but also huge experience. Empower is one of the organisations that many councils turn to that have provided services ranging from the strategic leadership through to support for frontline social work. I'd like to welcome Amanda Kelly, who's going to share a different perspective and perhaps in some ways a parallel perspective in the spirit of this plenary about the way that we drive forward the improvements we need to see both through inspection and improvement of children's services. Amanda.
Good morning. In many ways, I'd like to be presenting a different perspective, but I feel a bit like Jo's cheerleader because a lot of what I'm going to be saying follows on from what Jo has been talking about. I have to say there was quite a lot of debate in the Empower boardroom about the extent to which we got off the fence around Ofsted and the extent to which we actually put a point of view forward. It was quite nice to sort of sit there and maintain a neutral position. But probably over the last 18 months, 2 years, having been in a bit of a dubious position of sitting alongside 3 of my very large clients as they went through an Ofsted inspection, there was a sort of growing sense of a bad smell around it in terms of seeing some excellent people who I'd worked with over a long many years, had a great deal of respect for, falling on their sword, losing their jobs, but not just losing their jobs, actually losing their career. Talking to people who were putting their heart and soul into actually trying to deliver improvements in children's services and hearing them use the words devastating and traumatic. And it just seemed to me that there was a sense that something was going wrong and the balance of power was shifting too much in the area of Ofsted and its inspection regime and away from the people that are actually doing the work on the ground. So, as I slowly move through this, our starter for 10 then, the things I'm going to be covering off, is that Ofsted, for me, I feel it really isn't a force for good. at the moment. I really don't think that it is protecting children. The title of this session was about who should we put our trust in, and I'm not sure, I don't feel confident at the moment that we can put our trust in Ofsted, and I'll go through some reasons for that as I go through the presentation. I think as a sector we do need to look at an alternative service delivery model for children's services. When I use the word model, it's not necessarily in the sense of whether we're keeping it in-house or we move into a trust. It's actually looking at a different way of delivering services. We spend a huge amount of money at the moment on dealing with failure as opposed to tackling the problems earlier on through early intervention and prevention. And a lot of the work we've been doing with authorities, many of whom have had that inadequate judgment and in a way have a way from nowhere to go apart from up and to innovate and try new things, looking at a different model of working. And I think Joe's right that we do need to break down that sort of primacy of social care as being the only professionals who can actually protect our children. And then I do think we need to look at stability and leadership within the sector. I was talking to somebody the other week who was frightening me almost with the statistics that the average life expectancy for DCS these days is 2.8 years. Well, in a system where we need to actually look at systems leadership, that makes stability and fracturing very difficult to maintain. So, in terms of the current Ofsted model not being a force for good, I have to say this is a balance of probably contributions from clients and colleagues that I've talked to, as well as my own experience. It may be that some of you out in the audience have had a fantastic experience of Ofsted, and I would welcome your views on this. I've not yet found any of those, but I'm sure they are out there. The burden of the inspection process is huge, and you've got to start to consider, given the austerity measures that we are as a country facing, whether there is value for money there. I've talked to a number of colleagues who have ended up putting extra people on the ground, employing extra people, whether it's agency staff or putting people onto their payroll to actually get ready for Ofsted, clear those backlogs. I've also talked to people who spend an awful lot of money on people like me, consultants, to actually get you Ofsted ready. And it just doesn't seem right. But that burden of inspection doesn't just stop when the inspectors arrive. It happens throughout the inspection process. People stop doing their jobs. It was amazing to me the other week when I was working with one of my clients who are an inadequate client and they've been trying, inadequate judgment, they've been trying to improve. They were having, there's a huge amount of work that goes into an Ofsted inspection. People were simply not doing their day jobs because they were busy feeding the inspectors and the inspectors' requests for things, and the amount of information that was required was staggering. I think it is a deficit model of inspection, or at least that's the experience that I've experienced over the last 2 years with my clients. People come in with a view of looking for the good, the bad, and if you look for bad, you'll find it inevitably. There isn't seeming to be a recognition of the journey that people have been on, or the improvement that they've been on, or almost a recognition of the difficulties of trying to make some of these decisions day in, day out, when you're dealing with essentially risk uncertain. It also seems to be hypothesis driven, and there's a number of my clients that have talked to me about this that have said that it feels as though they'd already decided what the outcome was going to be before they even pitched up. I must admit I was a little bit on the fence about that, but having again recently been very closely aligned with a client that was going through Ofsted, that was definitely the case that I experienced. They'd done their analysis beforehand, they came with a view, and they set out to prove that hypothesis, which links to the other bit about the defensive organisation. It was almost laughable going through a sort of complaints procedure, which they called an independent complaints procedure, which is the closest I've probably been to a kangaroo court in some respects. It was quite shocking to me. I almost expected that if we presented the evidence, and again, that was a huge amount of burden on people to actually get the evidence back to counter the complaints that Ofsted was saying about us, it felt as though they weren't listening, and actually they came back a bit harder. And the information that came back in terms of a response to the evidence that we put forward as to why their hypothesis wasn't wrong, or really where they'd just got the information wrong, there was inaccuracies. It just seemed that they came back and hit a little bit harder because they were very defensive. And from that, you're finding that it isn't really facilitating a learning culture. So there's the power of that one little word, the inadequate judgment, which Joe has alluded to as well. You end up with a reputation shredded. The side effect of that is that you end up losing staff. You often lose the very good staff, which obviously puts you in a sort of downward spiral as well. As a result of that, you end up spending huge amounts on agency staff, and the demand increases. It's quite amazing, really, just in terms of the amount of workflow that suddenly increases, shoots through the roof. I've got some data that shows that. The impact of that, obviously, is in caseloads, and it goes into that sort of virtuous cycle, or not virtuous cycle, of people actually getting more workload, ending up with higher caseloads, ending up leaving, and you're in this constant battle of trying to get out of a system of failure. So some of the examples that we did recently, we looked at a number of authorities' data just in terms of trying to assess the impact of Ofsted. And if you think about one of the things a number of the things that drive improvement, it's things like the fact that you've got your workload under control, that you've got a stable workforce that's permanent, that you've got a system that's working together, you've got some financial stability, and that you've got quality of work, obviously the most important. You look at some of this data and it's quite stark, really, in terms of the impact that Ofsted has. So with this particular client, I've anonymised them. You've got referrals per 10,000 have gone from 455 pre-Ofsted up to 644 post-Ofsted. You've got the timeliness of initial assessments, which is an indicator of quality, apparently. It was low here anyway at 64%, but it flew down to 48% post-Ofsted. In this example, you've got timeliness of child protection reviews, again another indicator of quality, going from 96.8% down to 80%, and some of the stark increases in things like staff turnover down the bottom, going from 9 to 17%. This one's quite stark in terms of referrals per 10,000, going from 654 up to 1,122. But if you look down on agency staff, the percentage there from 13% up to 35%. Now you think about the impact that that's going to have on your budget. It's huge. So when we talk about needing a new model for delivering children's services, you, I think, as a sector, have already shown your ability to innovate. You've been managing to maintain services with a reducing budget envelope. That's only going to get worse, as we know. There was a recent report from LGA that was stipulating the fact that you can't continue to do this with efficiencies alone. You need to look at new ways of delivering services. So, Lynn, that's the work that we've been doing with a number of authorities recently, looking at the role that early intervention and prevention has. As I said earlier, we spend a huge amount on failure at the moment. We also do need to stop thinking that social care is the only way that we can protect our children, and it's the only avenue or the only route into protecting them and keeping them safe. One of the things that we've been working quite a lot with a number of clients is about trying to recognise that different role that agencies play through multi-agency safeguarding hubs, through joint assessments, and we need to stop privileging that social care assessment over all others. That makes it difficult when you're in the Ofsted model that we have at the moment, which does seem to put that as a primacy. And almost, I think one of the comments that we had from a recent inspector was that if it isn't a social care assessment, it doesn't actually count. Which, if you're giving that message out, not only to the people that work in the sector, but those outside of the sector, then you put yourself in a very difficult position. Back on that other thing as well, back on the other slide, one of the things that we've seen is a massive increase in the number of referrals. I think it's a 300% increase, which is a huge amount, but yet no corresponding increase in child abuse detection. So it makes you wonder the value of some of the assessments that we're doing. But the challenge that we have, that social care has, that local authorities have, is that huge super branding that social care has. And not in a good way like Marks and Spencer's or John Lewis. It's really a debilitating effect, because so many people believe that the only way that you get an assessment, the only way to access services is through social care, despite the fact that a number of the referrals, and in this case down the bottom there on the graph, more than 20% of the referrals in actually didn't even meet the thresholds for receiving a service. So we've got a sort of double whammy at the moment in terms of trying to restart a conversation not only with our partners but also with children and families in our local communities, as well as trying to deal with quite a centralist approach from Ofsted about the right way to do social care and the right way to protect our children. do you know where I find quite, I don't know how you feel about this, I find that quite insulting in a sense. When you go back and you actually challenge Ofsted, the thing that often comes back is we make no apologies for the fact that we are hard and we hold people to account, as though everybody else who's working in this sector doesn't care quite as much as they do, and I find that quite offensive. My final point really was around stability in leadership, and it echoes many of the things that Joe said. I actually feel that we need to man up a little bit in some of this as a sector, not only from places like the professional bodies like ADCS. I just think there needs to be more in terms of you setting the agenda about improvement. I don't think we need to leave it down to Ofsted to determine whether something is good or not. Certainly, I think there is a role for inspection and independent inspection and people holding a spotlight up or a mirror up to us. But I believe it's up to us to actually determine what is good and what improvement looks like, because you're the people that do this and you do it very well. I simply don't believe the studies that say that, or the percentages at the moment that suggest that 75% are requiring improvement or are inadequate. That's not necessarily the experience that we have on the ground. So I would say that the sort of rallying call from me really is I think ADCS needs to step up. It needs to stop sitting on the fence. When I talk to them, I know they say that they do an awful lot of work behind the scenes. Actually, a number of people's careers and as we've seen, the sort of devastating impact of an inadequate judgment has on people who work in that sector, but most importantly on the children and families who exist within those communities, is huge. And those sorts of things happen in the court of public opinion, so doing stuff behind the scenes just doesn't really count as far as I'm concerned. Similarly, from an LGA or a local government perspective, I'd like to see you driving it more in terms of opening that debate and challenging Ofsted, and I think we're starting to see that happening more. I'd like to see you a bit more vocal views coming through about that, and really take them on in some respects and start to change that. Because what we're seeing is DfE is listening to Ofsted, and they're coming up at the moment with lots of alternative service delivery models. Things like trusts are hanging over people as if you're really bad, you'll end up with one of these. I think we need to move away from that. I think there is an opportunity to open up competition in this sector. I think as commissioners of those services, you're in a position to actually push those improvements forward and maybe not see something like a trust or competition as a force for bad, but as a force for good, for driving up improvements. My final thing was really that you can't inspect quality into a product or into a system. It's either there or it isn't. And I think you guys in the room have probably got the monopoly on knowing what good looks like, and I'd like to see you share that more between you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Amanda. That was a brilliant note to finish your presentation on, with the challenge back to the sector. The door certainly seems to be open at the Children and Young People Board. Quite recently we had the new not so new now perhaps, but the relatively new chairman of the Ofsted board come along and begin to engage in this conversation that says there is this widely shared concern about whether that system adds value. And I've certainly sat in a room with Edward Timpson, the Children's Minister, with a large group of young people who were describing their experiences of coming through the care system. I think the one thing that was very striking is that you would not know from their descriptions of what their lived experience was like whether the authority that they lived in and were looked after by was outstanding or inadequate. It seemed to have no bearing at all on what the lived experience of those children was like, and that's clearly a huge experience for all of us. So we have now some time for questions. There will be roving microphones. The lights have appeared. I can now see you all, which is great. So please do raise your hands. Right, gentleman on the aisle, and then lady further here. Sorry, Richard, you need to keep your hand up until the microphone arrives. There you go.
Good morning. Thank you, panel. I'm going to be slightly controversial. Amanda, you did refer to that we had to get the consultants in to clear the backlog before the inspectors turned up. I'm sorry, if you've got a backlog of cases, if you haven't got control of the referrals and the number of referrals coming in, it's not Ofsted, it's actually internal processes that need looking into. If you've got more than 30% of cases being dealt with no further action, then it's people like me, my colleagues, and anybody else who has a concern for outcomes from children's services that need to do something about it. It's not waiting for Ofsted to come along and say whether that's good or bad or indifferent. And I do think we need to challenge ourselves. If we have a referral process which is delivering a backlog onto the inbox shelf, if you like, then what is it within your systems that's creating that? Get a grip. And I think that's where we mustn't just blame Ofsted here. We have got to make sure, and we talked about you talked about system redesign, and that is about the early years. It is about the early help. It is about making sure the referrals, the risk is held within the system. But that's for us to manage. And almost I think the Ofsted inspection is almost secondary to that. We shouldn't conflate those two issues, would be my comment.
We'll take a couple of questions together.
Hi, Cassie Harrison from Bernardo's. Thanks for two very interesting speeches. Given the context that you've set out, I'm quite interested in how you see the role of the voluntary and community sector in all this, and not just in the kind of transactional relationship that we've traditionally had together, but actually in a more strategic way, coming together to look at some of these big challenges and think collectively about what the needs are and what the solutions might be.
So get a grip and think strategically. Amanda, would you like to respond to those?
Yeah. I absolutely agree with you in terms of not just doing things because Ofsted are coming in. Too often I've actually seen that happen where people have brought extra staff in when it was not consultants to clear the backlog, it was actually extra agency staff to see whether we're Ofsted ready. My challenge has always been to my clients that you shouldn't be trying to pass the Ofsted test. But too often that seems to be the game that a number of people are trying to play in terms of trying to get the tick box through. I absolutely agree with you that what we need to be doing is setting our own stall out in terms of what is a standard of good practice, a standard of improvement, and we ought to be monitoring ourselves. It's one of the things I say to politicians, particularly on the scrutiny committee. You need to be looking at a number of things. It's probably only 5. If those things are going awry, then actually the quality of your service is likely to be falling over somewhere, but hidden behind statistics. So I agree with you. I don't think it's down to Ofsted to drive that thing through. It's down to the sector to do that. My point was more that we've got too many people trying to pass a test, and the burden of doing that from an Ofsted perspective is huge financially, but also on staff time and capability. In terms of the role of the voluntary and community sector, I would like to see more of everybody coming together. When we look at almost like a rainbow coalition when we're delivering children's services, I agree with Joe that it shouldn't just be seen as the domain of local authorities. You know, there's a huge amount of expertise and experience out there. And I think you're right, we do tend to have almost a transactional relationship. We bring them into on a commissioning basis. We want you to do this. You work out whether you can deliver it or not and we'll pay you, as opposed to really enhancing their sort of intellectual capability to thinking about some of the commissioning requirements that we have.
Joe.
Richard, I don't think you're remotely controversial. You are absolutely bang on. I completely agree. And when I said that at the time we were about to come out of intervention, the authority had spent millions putting money into referral and assessment, and I described it as a giant laundry. And all we did was put more and more washing in the laundry, and we spent more and more people on money on people assessing whether it needed to go in the machine or not. Yeah. And in the meantime, the washing on the floor was getting more dirt soiled just because it was in the laundry. Those families were not getting the help they need. And when you speak to women, as I have, who've been, you know, beaten to not far within an inch of their life, and they won't access services because they are afraid of their children being taken off them. We have to do something different around help to those families that isn't just about seeing everything through a social care lens, whilst accepting we've got to do that. So I'm totally with you. Bernardo's, when I talked about, if I wasn't an authority that had been in intervention, I think you might have guessed from the way I spoke, I'd be more than willing to consider a different model, but not just one that kind of takes the old wine and puts it in a new bottle. but one that looks at having innovation at its heart. And I think the third sector, people like Bernardo's, have a really strong role to play in some of those models, not transactionally, but as a strategic partner. I was talking to Age UK yesterday, and I said, why is it in a lot of places, if you think about in a lot of places, Age UK is the place to go to if you are a pensioner, be that around you have travel insurance, what to do about downsizing your house, making a will, or knitter and natter. Those. Why aren't those relationships there in relation to some of our children and families? And very often the regulator is not the best person to do that with, in my view.
There's a gentleman here, and then there's a hand up just on the left-hand side we'll take next, and then one on the back. Thank you.
Thanks. It's Dan Jeffrey. I'm the lead member for Children's Services at Southampton City Council. It's a very quick question. Just in relation to, it's a question for Joe about, you talked about the sort of some of the vested interests in terms of the model you went down at Doncaster. How did you get around that? Obviously, I'm not just talking about people like trade unions, but in terms of the professional class, did you come up against much professional resistance to the direction that you wanted to go in?
A bit.
So we'll take. Sorry. So if you could just put your hand up again, so the microphone can come to you. That's great. Lady on the left. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Lorna Cork from Sedgmoor District Council. My concern is that there's obviously a problem within councils for safeguarding children. And I understand in Scotland they're trying to push for a named person to be in every family. And my concern is that this would be pushed into England to sort of take up. And where families might well be functioning very well, it could totally undermine them. So is this something that you're aware of that's in maybe a pipeline? I do hope not, having brought up 4 children. Yes, I just wondered if you'd heard of it, were aware of it.
Okay, right. The next 2 questions, there's a gentleman at the back. So if you could just wave your hand, so the back of the front group of seats to your right. So could you, gentleman who's just put his hand up, and then the gentleman at the front. So Joe, if you want to answer those, and then we'll come to those questioners.
Dan, really briefly, we transferred those 480 staff without any strike, without any industrial unrest. It was a gargantuan effort in terms of communication, and the thing I found particularly difficult was saying to all those staff on the day they transferred, just trust me, I promise I'll make this happen, when the one thing DCLG had to do, which was around a redundancy payments order and making sure their previous service kind of carried over, that didn't happen, and in fact it happened on the day that Parliament was prorogued after some pushing from our MPs. So more than happy to speak to you about that afterwards. Lorna, if that happens, I'll be absolutely horrified. I do think we need to ask what the state is for. It actually drives me slightly crazy, to be honest. Why do we insist that if a family make their own arrangements to looking after a child, why does the state have to know, per se? Families look after families and have done since time immemorial. And I do think we need to think about when the state steps in and when it helps people to help itself. And as a mother of children myself, I can tell you, no one's having a name in my family.
Amanda, did you want to?
No, I'd just say the same. I'd be absolutely horrified if that happens. And we need to get away from thinking, again, that the way that we keep children safe is by doing an assessment on them. That's the sort of thing about children in need assessments. One of my colleagues was saying, all you're doing if you do that is lobbing another needle into an ever-increasing haystack. It doesn't make children safer. We need to start making people think about doing things in a different way.
Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes left. So number 1, gentleman here, and then gentleman right at the front row here.
Thank you. David Kershaw from Coventry, Cabinet Member. I'm really challenged by the attitudes of not all, but many social workers, and I find it really challenging to look at the rather strange structures of support and challenge that they experience in their daily professional work. Am I being naive? Is that an issue elsewhere? Or is that perhaps at the heart of the problem about the ethos, the attitudes, the philosophy, the view of many of our colleagues who I recognise are doing an incredibly challenging and difficult job?
Thank you. And gentleman in the front row.
Thank you, David. Philip Simpkins, Chief Exec, Bedford Borough. Speaking as a Chief Exec of a Children's Services Authority, could I ask Jo how she manages on a day-to-day basis the trust to know that things are okay? You outlined the high-level vision, but how do you measure it on a day-to-day basis? And how does that differ from how you would manage it if it was still an in-house services?
Two really good questions. Jo, do you want to again answer those first?
Yeah, briefly to David, we need more innovation in social work, but I don't want to denigrate social workers for the job they do. I think it's an impossible task. I think it's actually about us as a country. You know, every time something happens to a child, it's social workers and public servants who've killed children. It's not. It's normally the people who are closest to them who let them down. All that said, I do think we need to bust a myth that care is a great destination for children. Unless you take young children and resettle them into different homes, or you put a short, sharp shock into a family and enable people to come back, you know, it's not a good place to be in care, no matter what. And we need to bust some of that myth. So, I think you're right to challenge back though, and use the experience of every day. And if it hasn't come across to you, I come from a family that experienced both good and lived in a family that experienced both good and bad social work practice, which is part of the fire in my belly. Phil, it's fair to say this is still a work in progress for us. The Trust is independent. We have monthly meetings between the DCS and the Trust. We thought about whether DCS would be in the Trust. We decided against it. And there is an issue about the kind of whole statutory set of responsibilities and how that works. We have quarterly meetings and basically a whole set of meetings. I'll put a link up to the assurance framework. But what I'm really clear about is that the Trust's performance, you know, how the council behaves also affects how the Trust behaves, and they must both be grounded in the Safeguarding Board, where I also have a one-to-one with the Safeguarding Board every 2 months. So I'll put a link up to that later. But there are a whole set of contractual accountabilities, which for me are just a given, but that's our partnership's got to be more than the contract.
Thank you. Amanda.
I think just on the comment about the attitude of social workers, I think we've tended to get into a situation where we've consistently been trying to measure the pig by weighing it. The problem with that is, having spoken to a number of heads of service last year, where we were trying to work out what it was that got them out of bed in the morning, just so we could understand their motivations, so we could start to change the way that we set things up for them. They were driven to some extent by, they got up in the morning and we log on to Care First and we put this data in and we do this. It's a very transactional kind of arrangement. That's not for everybody, but we do seem to have got into that situation with a number of social workers, which I think isn't their fault. They're just measured by that. Their performance managed on the basis of those sorts of things, rather than thinking about the outcomes for children. And maybe if we started to take that step back and think about that, then maybe their attitudes would change as well, because I know they want to do their best.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time for this session. Thank you all very much indeed for the questions. I guess a quick summary response from the Local Government Association. As Councillor Roberts laid out that challenge, we need to go away and make sure that the way we lead and manage the services that we run meets the standards that we would all expect. And we know sometimes we aren't doing that as well as we could. But I can promise both of you we shall certainly be very robustly challenging Ofsted and the wider sector, because what's happening at the moment is not up to standard, it is not adding value, and it is not acceptable, and we need to see that change. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.